and just record, and we'll have to figure out how to post it afterwards. So welcome everyone. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. Very excited to welcome you this evening to our fifth installment of a joint project between New Hampshire Peace Action and the United Church of Christ Peace with Justice Advocates of New Hampshire Mission Group, to explore the spirituality of peace building. We want to begin our meeting tonight by acknowledging that the land where we live and work was not uninhabited when European settlers arrived here with their ideas of conquest and ownership. For most of us, we're living on the ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. I want to take a moment to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. I want to pause and remember that we live on ground that is sacred, ground that was stolen, ground that cries out for justice and responsible stewardship. And may our remembering help us find the courage to do our part to restore wholeness to the earth and all of her peoples. Historically, movements for peace and justice have largely been led by people of faith. And the beliefs of those people have led them to fight for the dignity of others. In my time as a peace activist, I've developed a particular interest in the work of people of faith because I've noted that the ways people ground their work in faith can help protect them from the chronic burnout that is endemic in our movements. And I know that I experience a kind of fueling when I'm working with the UCC Peace with Justice advocates. And that's what led me to want to pursue this series with that mission group. Tonight, we're really excited to bring you Dr. Edith Rasell. She's an economist and a pastor who has closely examined both the Old and the New Testaments to identify biblical instructions about economic justice. What she found is that the Bible teaches that Jesus and God are concerned about how people fare economically. Jesus said he came so that all may have an abundant life in John 10:10, and it's clear that he was not referring just to the spiritual realm, but also to material circumstances. Jesus healed people's bodies, but he also fed people and told his followers to do the same. So the Bible teaches that everyone is worthy of the resources necessary for an abundant material life, as well as an abundant spiritual life. So Edith's work has led her to look closely at the extensive biblical instructions about the economy and look at their relevance to our economy today. So Edie, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and take it away.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks to Will, and thanks to Doreen, and thanks to New Hampshire Peace Action. And I also want to thank Reverend John Gregory Davis and Pastor Gail Kinney and Claudia Istel for their work in kind of putting this whole thing together. But to begin, I want to just say in a few words a little bit of what Will just said in the introduction, because it is the starting place, I think, so we're all people of faith here, and I'm sure we're familiar with the Bible, but I think some of what Will said and what I want to begin with is familiar to us, but somehow it doesn't really sink in. So I just want to repeat a couple of things. That God cares about how we fare materially, and when I talk about things that are material, I mean things like food and housing, education, healthcare, economic security, things that our bodies and our minds need to flourish. So God cares how we fare materially as well as spiritually, number one. And number two is that everybody is worthy, right? I want to just quote a passage from Matthew that, again, I'm sure everybody is familiar with. It's in the same passage where Jesus is talking about love your enemies. But here is what he is saying to his fellow people living in Galilee, who are primarily people who work the land, who are farmers or work on farms. And how they fare depends upon how much rain comes, how much sun there is, right? And so Jesus says, God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. So God thinks even the evil and the unrighteous deserve, apparently, a bountiful harvest, right? An abundant material living over the following year. God thinks everybody is worthy of God's material resources. Okay, so I think these are our starting points in my mind anyway. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into both the Old and New Testaments. And I want to name three, and I realize I'm just going to like drone on here. I feel a little bit weird, but I'm going to speak. I understand your common practice is for me to speak for about half the time, and then we'll do Q&A and comments for the other half. So I'm just going to like move right along here until Bell tells me to not anymore. But so here, looking at the Old and New Testament, I'm going to mention three characteristics of a just economy that I think are demonstrated in those biblical narratives. And I'm going to also then tell you why I think those are justified and how they come out of the biblical text. So first of all, the first principle of a just economy is that everybody is to thrive, right? Everybody is to live abundant life. God cares about what we do materially, how we are materially. And so we're all supposed to be thriving with enough, not excess, but have enough that all of our material needs are met. Okay. Nobody is poor. Everybody thrives. Okay. And how is that to happen? Well, people help each other. And I don't think I need to trace that out. Most people that are Christians get that part of it. We're supposed to help each other when they have unmet needs. But the other way that people are to thrive is that everyone would have a livelihood, a way to make a living, earn a living. Everybody would have a livelihood that enabled them to support a thriving family. Now, how do I get this out of the Old and New Testament? You know, in the very ancient days, the time of the judges, as we call it, everybody had land, and they thought the land had been given to them by God, right? And people would occasionally fall into poverty, and there were laws about helping the widows and the orphans, but everybody had land. And if someone did fall into hard times when they had their land, people were instructed to lend them what they needed, right? And to generally help out and not even charge interest on the loans. And land was passed from family to family across the generations. And land meant people had food. If you had land, it meant you had food. You had shelter. You could make some kind of shelter, whether out of trees or bricks or stones or something. You could make shelter. You had fuel. You had economic security, right? You had everything that in the day people needed if you had land. And so we move forward in time to the time of the monarchy, and people are losing their land. It's often because of debt, or maybe the king confiscated some land. But people are beginning to lose their land. And so we see in the law, the Old Testament law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that there are more and more protections to help people retain their land. So first of all, there's a law that says land cannot be bought or sold. Okay. And then Moses commands that if people have needs, open your hand and relieve their need. Okay. Relieve their need, let them have the seeds, let them have food so they can hopefully stay on their land. If you lend, don't extract interest. And more than that, after 6 years, debts are to be canceled. If you do lose your land, a family member, if they can, is supposed to redeem it, meaning you'd buy it back from the creditor. And if all else failed, and you did lose your land, during the year of Jubilee that happened every 50 years, you would get it back. Now, it's true the Jubilee year probably never was practiced, but nonetheless, it was a law, God's law, and a way to help ensure that people maintained and retained their land, right? So this idea that people have livelihood that will support a thriving family is really central to all of that. And then Jesus comes, first century, common era. Most people have lost their ancestral land. Jesus knows nobody's going to get land back from the Romans. So what did Jesus have to suggest in terms of how people were going to maintain themselves and stay out of poverty? Well, if you look at Matthew chapter 20, Jesus tells a parable that he says describes the reign of God on earth as it is in heaven. I've added that part out of the Lord's Prayer, right? But Jesus describes the reign of God by saying it's like a vineyard owner who in Jesus' parable is now taking kind of stand in for God, a vineyard owner who goes to the marketplace one day to hire laborers. And he goes first thing in the morning, hires a bunch of people, tells them he'll pay them the usual daily wage. And they say, fine, they go work. 4 more times during the course of the day, Jesus goes back. I mean, not Jesus, sorry. The land owner, the vineyard owner goes back and he hires all the people he sees. And he tells them he'll pay them what's fair. At the end of the day, and I think people probably know this parable, at the end of the day, what? He paid them all the same amount, right? And the ones that had worked all day grumble. But the landlord, the vineyard owner says, I'm being generous. Are you upset because I'm generous? And so I want to suggest that Jesus' solution to the fact that people did not have land and a way to support themselves in a thriving family was to ensure that everybody had a job that paid a living wage. And so in my mind, the Bible tells us the first principle of the first characteristics of a just economy is that everybody thrives. And the way that this happens is that if people have needs, we meet their needs. But basically, it happens because everybody has a livelihood that supports a thriving family. Okay, I'm going to move on. We can come back to some of this. A second principle is sustainability. The economy must be sustainable. Now, where in the world does this come from in the Old and New Testaments, right? I think it comes from the whole concept of the Sabbath day and the Sabbath year. And I realize time is flying, and I'm going to also try to move along here. Sabbath day, the Sabbath year, when work was not done. There was a rest for people, all people, animals, and the land. And during the Sabbath day, and during the Sabbath year, the whole long year when nothing was planted, what was the purpose? The purpose was to rest, kind of renew yourself, spend time with family, friends, and spend time with God, right? The purpose I want to suggest was wholeness. This word shalom that we hear. Wholeness. Wholeness for the land, wholeness for animals, wholeness for people. And that is certainly connected to what we today think about as sustainability. The third principle I want to mention that characterizes a just economy is that it's fair and it accomplishes its purpose, which is to provide abundance for all people and all creation. Now, I'm going to very quickly move from there and say, so if these are 3 characteristics of a just economy, what kind of economic policies today would get us to that place where we had a just economy? Again, I'm being very sketchy, but I'm hopeful that we can cover some of this in some of the Q&A and in the discussion. So how are we going to have everybody thrive? An important way to bring this about would be if the United States recognized and fulfilled economic human rights. I realize this is not a term that we use. You can look it up online under the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it just says that just like people have a right to vote for the most part, so that's a political right, economic human rights say that people, just because you're a person, have a right to things like food, housing, the very things that we've been talking about. So for the US to recognize and put in our law these economic human rights would be through a way to accomplish our first goal, the first characteristic of a just economy. Number two would be sustainability. How do we accomplish that? I hope you've heard of net zero growth, where, let me say that we continue to have economic growth as a primary focus of our economy. But over the last 40 years, we've nearly tripled the economy, adjusted for inflation. Per person, we've nearly doubled the economy, but we still have the same amount of poverty as we did in terms of percentages as we did 40 years ago. Most of that growth has benefited people who don't need any more stuff. And meanwhile, it has really harmed the environment. So what many people are calling for is net zero growth, where we do have development and a change in what we produce and a change in who benefits from it. But overall growth does not happen. Our GDP does not grow. Okay, controversial, but many people around the world are calling for that as the only solution going forward. And three, how do we have an economy that fulfills its purpose, which is to make sure it produces the stuff that everybody needs to thrive, produces and we distribute so that everybody has all they need to thrive. I suggest the only way that that's going to happen is through democratic governance of the economy. And following Jesus' example, we, like him, need to all get involved to make it happen. Okay, I'm gonna pause there. And I know that's a really speedy trip through all those different issues, but I'm hopeful that we can have more discussion on things that, that you want to have more discussion about.
Thank you so much.
I'm happy to go over anything again. I know it was really quick, a lot of stuff.
That's great. So folks, you can feel free to, you can put an asterisk in the chat. The hand raise emoji will work if I see it, but it's easiest to put an asterisk in the chat if you want to be called on, or you can feel free to type your questions in the chat if you'd like me to read them off instead of asking them yourself. Either way is fine by me. There was a film, and you might know it off the top of your head, that we showed as part of the Building a Culture of Peace Forum a few years back. I don't remember what it was called, but it really was about how economic growth as a central guiding principle is deleterious to human rights. And I wish I could remember what it was called, but I remember showing it. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I'm sure somebody on the call remembers, but it's a fascinating place to go with it, that this focus on growth is part of what is sick about our economy.
Yeah. Maybe I'll say a few words. I don't know anything in the chat, or go ahead, Will. I could always say a few words about growth, but go ahead.
No, that was it. I was just looking in the chat. There's a Happy May Day message there, but go ahead and what are you thinking?
Well, just what I just said. Growth in the global north is destroying the economy, destroying the environment, and not benefiting people who need it. In the global south, it's a whole different situation, right? They do need more stuff. And there is growth needed there, although the right kind of growth. Globally, growth over the last 20, 30, 40 years has primarily benefited people who already have tons of stuff. And so even in the global south, we need growth that is, as they say, pro-poor, that is going to help people that actually need things. And we need pro-poor growth here in the United States as well, right? And not just this helter-skelter, whatever's going to bring the most profit kind of growth.
What do folks have for questions? I think once we break the ice here, they'll flow right in.
maybe should I just keep saying something, Will?
Yeah, feel
Okay.
free. We've
I kind of, in the effort to get to the kind of the end of my remarks, I would normally pause, and we can't really do discussion here, but let me just ask this question. You consider it rhetorically. I think it's kind of a simple question, but it's a question that nobody can really answer. What is the purpose of the economy? Now, before we really get to that, let me just say, when I say economy and talk about, 200 or 2000 BCE, it's kind of like, what is she talking about? But when I say economy, I'm talking about the way we produce stuff and what we produce and under what conditions we do that. So the economy is how we take all of our resources, whether it's fuels or trees or soil and the sun, or human ingenuity, human power, animal power, how we use all that stuff to make the things that we make, how we do it, who benefits, how it's done, does it ruin the environment while it's happening, et cetera. So how we do all that and what we do and the rules under which we make it happen, that's the economy. So you can talk about an economy from 2000 years ago and it makes total sense. And so then and now, what is the purpose of the economy? It's something I don't think we ever think about, right? It's not, I don't think, it's not to grow it's not growth, right? That is not the purpose of the economy. High profits are not the purpose of the economy. What is the purpose? What's the purpose of us going to work and doing all this stuff and using all these resources? The purpose is to create all the things we need to thrive, to have a thriving society, right? Thriving people in a thriving society. And so then the question is, how is that going to happen?
How do we build an economy that serves abundance for everyone?
Exactly.
Rather than an economy that was designed to funnel wealth upward. So there is a comment in the chat that I'll read, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gail, who has a question. So the comment is, as a Universalist Quaker, I read Jesus as a major prophet, and want to bring up that many of the native peoples of this area lived the message of Jesus without having heard it until Europeans arrived. That indigenous economies, not just here but all over the world, are based on getting everybody's needs met. And then Gail, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, and just you triggered a comment too. There are a number of theologians, and the theologian Howard Thurman comes to mind, who has written extensively about how these sort of basic human values are personified in cultures that were never exposed either to the biblical sentiments or whatever. So there's something that bubbles up that's basic values, and whether it's not necessarily denominationally or religiously based, but exists at the core of humanity, unless it's taken away by people with power who no longer see it in their best interest to embrace those core values. But Edie, I just want to say that in this country at this point in time, there are a ton of people, not necessarily the people on the screen, who would insist vociferously that this is a Christian nation. And yet, what you're talking about, those basic core values, that if they really read, whether it was the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, or whether there's the New Testament, is not reflected in the policies that they promote. So just give me some hope as to how we can, the core is there, but how do we get it into lived reality from people who claim to be religious or spiritual or to embrace these core values?
Well, let me start by being also pessimistic. The conflict between, I'm just going to say, Jesus' message or some of these great messages that we find in the Old Testament, even within the Bible, it's contested, right? And I don't know that we need to get into all this here. Some of the preachers among us could do it in the future, possibly, but But even Paul's message, there's what they talk about, the letters from Paul, and then the pseudo-Pauline letters, and the ones that really weren't Paul, and you see the message being changed and reversed as time goes by in the Christian church, the followers of Jesus who opposed Rome and then became complicit with the Roman Empire, under Constantine. So we see we have a hard time, right? These messages, Jesus' message, God's will for us, it's hard for us to accept it. And I don't know what the hope is. The hope is that by continuing to act with faith and love, that we can convert people. That's the hope, right? And I'm going to say one more thing. If people that have pursued a spiritual path, we're all pursuing a spiritual path, but in greater depth, I think they read, they learn from people, from spiritual directors or whatever, that you cannot make yourself be a deeper spiritual person, right? You can seek that and put yourself in a position possibly to receive those gifts and graces from God, but I can't make it happen myself. I have to just do what I can to cultivate the soil, right? Cultivate the soil and wait for the blessings to come. And I think the same thing is true about our social justice activism. That what you're talking about, Gail, I think it's such a heavy lift that only God can do it. But we must nevertheless persist and cultivate the soil, not knowing when God is going to step in and act and finally make it happen. And so we need to persist, continue, keep up the hope, and then wait for God to act.
Thanks, Edie. We've got so Alyssa Barr, who was on the steering committee for the Building a Culture of Peace Forum, is pretty sure that the film, and I think she's right, is Naomi Klein's "This Changes Everything."
Okay.
That talks about, and one of the things that I remember from that film was that one of the ways that economic growth was increased is trading in the same commodities overseas. So we would send, X number of tons of beef to Japan, who would send X number of tons of beef back to us. And that's growth because there's commerce. But it actually wasn't, it was like they were making, they were subsidizing it in order to make growth, just show that the economy was growing, rather than finding ways to do that supported human dignity. Got a few good things in the chat. I'm gonna read Will Thomas's question. He says, "Would Jesus be a capitalist or a democratic socialist today, or might he support a mixed economy? Also, do the Torah and the Quran echo what the New Testament says?" So, do you think there are models of economic system out there that some of the prophets and spiritual leaders that we look to in holy texts would support right now?
First of all, I don't use terms like capitalism, socialism. I think everybody has their own definition of that stuff, and they're such hot words that they're not useful. I don't use them. So what kind of an economy would Jesus embrace? I think he would embrace something like what I'm calling democratic governance of the economy. And I'm not sure which of the isms that defines. I'm not sure it defines any of them, to tell you the truth, because it's got nothing to do with who owns what. It has to do with how are we fulfilling the purpose of the economy, right? And what, whoever's owning whatever it is, what are they doing with it? Are they producing what we need or what we don't need? How are they producing it? How much pollution? What kind of wages? What kind of wages? We've got to, and I say this recognizing how flawed our political economy is. But there's nothing better, right? Flawed as it is, there's nothing better. And I think we got to bite the bullet and bad Alan. Anyway, we've got to recognize the same thing about the economy.
Thanks. I frequently feel the same way that using words
No,
like
it's a good
capitalism,
question.
socialism. It was a great question. But that sometimes those words, make people make assumptions about what you're saying when what I think our core message ought to be as social justice advocates is that the system needs to change with the times, and it needs to change to do the job that we want it to do, which is to serve people living lives of dignity, right? So there are a bunch of comments. We've got Leo saying people take out of religion what they bring to it. We need to create better people. This is something that's come up in our UCC Peace with Justice Advocates meeting. That one of the things that we should be talking about is living your life in a way of conscience. So we've got David Erickson. Didn't Paul write that we are God's hands and feet, which implies that God can't do it alone, at least in human affairs.
Absolutely. Right. We need to get in there. Exactly. Right.
I've always been a person who struggles with the existence of anything beyond, but I do think if there's a God, they're us, right? Like they are all of us and all of what's around us. And so in that way, we are, I like that writing from Paul. We are God's hands and feet. Like it's our job to make that future, and that there is intent to it because we put that intent into it. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna, I can move on to something else. I'm just looking here at my notes. What can I jump into saying?
Can I ask you what inspired you to write your book?
Well, I worked for 15 years for the United Church of Christ, Minister for Economic Justice. And during that time, and I'm an economist. And so people would ask me, what's a good book I can read on the economy? And that's the book I started out to write, just kind of about the economy, and then bring in some kind of general kind of theological, God says, love everybody, so we need to be nice to everybody, kind of more general. But in the course of writing it, I somehow went down this other path of looking at these three biblical eras, and I didn't really get into this, but I looked at what we call the time of the judges, kind of depicted in Exodus maybe, and then the time of the monarchy, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and then of course in Joshua, Judges. I'm just talking now about what we call what the Jews call the Torah, what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So look at these 3 periods of time, the third period being when Jesus was on earth, first century, and see what the Bible said about the economy in each of those periods. So I had to know what was going on with the economy, and then what did the Bible say about it? And, I was surprised to find these consistencies, this concern about livelihood, that people had a livelihood, which we today would call full employment, although that word is used to cover a lot of different things. And sometimes it doesn't mean a job for everybody at all. And when I say job for everybody, I don't necessarily mean paid employment. If you're a mother or a father taking care of kids or taking care of elders, that's a job. Whether you're getting paid for it or not, right? Or maybe you're studying music or doing your art or whatever. So, but doing something. I see the Bible telling us that jobs are a right. We have a right, to use today's terminology, to a livelihood that enables us to support a thriving family. But a job is also an obligation. the landlord, the vineyard owner went out, and everybody he saw that was standing around unemployed, he said, come and work, right? We can't be freeloaders, right? In order to eat, in order to have a roof over my head, somebody's got to make this stuff, produce this stuff, and I've got to be part of that. To the extent that I am able, I need to be part of. I have a responsibility to society to contribute my labor. So work is a right, but it's also an obligation. And I saw these parallels, across the time periods in the Bible.
That's great. In the chat, we've got Leo Sandy bringing up the term praying with your feet, which John says was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel said it while marching with MLK. Praying with your feet as an ideal that we build the world where we want, and that is our prayer. That is us working as God and God working through us.
Mm-hmm. There was somebody else, and I'm sure somebody on the call, I think might have been St. Augustine or maybe Francis of Assisi, said, preach the gospel at all times, and when you have to, use words. Who said that? I think John nodded his head. Who said that?
St. Francis.
Oh, St. Francis. Okay.
I love that. When you have to use
I should keep. Should I keep going? Let me see what
I think feel free to. I'm fascinated by what you're saying, and I don't want to dominate the discussion, and we haven't had a ton of questions, but if you've got ideas, go ahead.
No, I can always talk. I just got to pick the right thing here. So you just somehow indicate to me when I should be wrapping it up, and because you've got a question.
Yeah, okay. We've got about 15 minutes left, so we've got plenty of space.
If you get a question.
Okay. We do have there's a comment, but I'm gonna have to ask Leo, what is UDHR? He says placing the UDHR in every public building and having it discussed. Oh, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Should have known that, Leo. Sorry. In every building and having it discussed in every classroom would raise consciousness to a high level and impel social action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's true. Yeah. You can respond to that, or you can take it away with what you were going to say.
Yeah. I mean, in the UCC, we talk about the continuing testament. I hope people have heard that term. So we have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and we have the continuing testament. And I suggest that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is part of our continuing testament, the testifying to God's intentions and God's, interactions with God's people. Now to go back to my story, so I looked at these 3 periods of time. And in the highlands, the time of the judges, after the Israelites had more or less arrived in Canaan and settled in the highlands, archaeologists who today have investigated some of those sites, done archaeological digs, say that the societies were incredibly egalitarian, which I'm just like, really, there were no luxury goods. The houses were all about the same size. There were not big monumental structures or big houses or castles or palaces. So a very egalitarian society. And people say that it became normative for the rest of the history of the Israelites. So it's what the prophets were kind of referring back to when they had their visions and their critique of what was going on later on during the monarchy, hundreds of years later. So there was that egalitarian society where extended families had their land, passed it down across the generations. People were able to thrive, support themselves through thriving, and thrive through their work. You get to the time of the monarchy, about 700 or 800 years later, and people are using their land. There's the rise of poverty. And you see this reflected in the law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, as opposed to the law in Exodus. So in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there's many more provisions for how to treat poor people. So for the first time, there's law about gleaning. People can go on private property and take food, God, what a concept, right? They have what they call, get this, the sacred tithes, the sacred portion. I'm forgetting already what it's called, the sacred portion, which was a 10% tithe of all you produce as a farmer. 10% of it goes to a central location, the sacred portion that was made available to people that didn't have land and needed food. So way back then, there's taxation to a central location by central authority to support the poor, right? So these provisions to help make sure that poor people had what they needed. As poverty increased, the laws strengthened the protections for the poor. I keep going unless you.
No, that's great. We've got some stuff in the chat I can pull in. So, so David Erickson wants to know, what evidence can you share that the early Christian church was more in keeping with Jesus's message?
Well, this is getting a bit beyond my expertise, such as it is. But let me just say, some of the very early, in fact, I cite some of this in my book, wherever that is. Let me get some of this because it's pretty radical. Some of these very early, I'll use the term church fathers because I believe they were mostly males, at least the ones that come down to us. I'm going to read you a couple of these very radical things as soon as I find them. Well, and then we know, of course, in Acts, I'm sure everybody on this call or on this Zoom knows about Acts. Two communities, it seems, shared everything in common, right? Now, there were many early communities of Jesus followers, and probably only a few of them did share everything and hold everything in common, as described in Acts chapter 4 and chapter 2, I believe, looking here. So that was one example, right? But now moving forward a bit, Basil the Great, Bishop of Caesarea, this is in 330 to 379 CE. This may be a bit too much for a Zoom. He wrote this: "Will not one be called a thief who steals the garment of one already clothed? And is one deserving of any other title who will not clothe the naked if he was able to do so? That bread which you keep belongs to the hungry, that coat which you preserve in your wardrobe to the naked, those shoes which are rotting in your possession to the shoeless, the gold which you have hidden in the ground belongs to the needy. Wherefore, as often as you were able to help others and refused, so often did you do them wrong." So, that's pretty clear. It doesn't even belong to us, even if it's in our closet, if there are people that have needs, right?
Love that. So we've got a few comments in here. Gail says, "I can only imagine various legislatures considering the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to be subversive and banning it from classroom discussion." We have a divisive concept law that passed here. Where we're not really, teachers are, and of course in committee that legislation was said. This is just very narrowly focused on critical race theory being taught in schools, and of course in practice it has been used to go after teachers who have dared speak about race or LGBT people, or anything that is seen as divisive to folks who don't want to see progress in how we think socially. We've got a comment from Ernie, who's talking about a discussion on the rights of nature presented by Casey Camp Horenick of the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma. And in her talk, she says, "Land is not necessarily property to be bought and sold. Instead, land is a relationship with past, present, and future. Ownership is not control for profit. Instead, ownership is responsibility to assure life to coming generations of land." Got Leo says, "Early Christians were pacifists until Christianity became the official Roman religion." And Ernie says economics is a study started within the study of ethics. Wealth is not about money. Wealth is about maintaining and sustaining relatives. Thanks for those comments, folks. Do you have anything you wanted to add to any of those? Sorry to throw them all together.
No, in Leviticus, people don't own the land. So land is so important, right? In those early days, and land was owned by God. People were tenants. Land could not be bought and sold because it was owned by God. And God's distribution of that land was what was to be maintained. Well, that didn't happen. But it gets back to the idea of a commodity. Let's talk about commodities. A commodity is that things are bought and sold in a market, including, for example, labor. And here's the interesting thing, in this country to this day, we continue, especially in legal arenas, to argue about whether, if I agree to a contract, no matter what that contract says, is it a legal contract? Is there freedom of contract is the terminology. And so if you believe, as many conservative legal scholars do, that we should have complete freedom of contract, I could agree. If I was hungry, couldn't find a job, I could agree to work for 50 cents an hour, right? Because if I'm agreeing to it, what's the problem? It's my freedom. I agree. Somebody else wants to hire me for that. Who's to step in and say no, But in the Bible, there is no freedom of contract. They say, I know I'm going to paraphrase a bit, that even if you're really poor and really, really need to borrow some food to feed your family, and would agree to pay back, 50% interest, you cannot sign that contract. You cannot agree to that contract because interest is prohibited, right? If I give up my cloak as collateral, I don't care what I might be forced to agree to, you're going to have to give it back to me at sundown, right? So freedom of contract is not in the Bible.
All right, we got 2 questions in the chat, and that'll probably be about all we've got time to do. I'm going to do Leo's first, and then I'm going to move to John's. So Leo says, Archibald Cox said that the true church is a resistance church. Can you comment?
No, exhibit number 1 would be the Exodus, right? Led the slaves out of slavery. Yes. God is not a supporter of the status quo. Many gods are supporters of the status quo, supporters of the power structures that are not willing to rock the boat, not willing to upturn everything, right? Not willing to put the last first, for example. But our God is not that God. Our God is one who upends the status quo.
All right, and the final question, this probably give you it's a little bit of new, but it also will give you a chance to summarize. So John says, fear of scarcity seems to be at the heart of our economy, yet you suggest there's a way of abundance?
Which John was that?
That would be John Gregory Davis.
We live in tough times in many ways. And let me point out, because we lack economic security, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow and I'm 20 years old and can't work for the rest of my life, say I'm severely disabled, who's taking care of me? And are they going to ensure that I thrive? And it probably would be good if I had a bunch of wealth, because otherwise I am probably not going to thrive. So we're caught in this position that I do need my daily bread, thank you. And that would imply that I don't need to be worried about scarcity. I don't need to worry about tomorrow. And Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow. God knows what you need. God will give it to you, right? God gives it to society, and it's up to society to share it with everybody who needs it. But we don't do that. So therefore, maybe I do need some wealth, It's a very tough question. There is no scarcity. God gives us abundance. But it's up to us to make sure that it gets shared, right? So I don't know if that's a summary. I think of a summmory. Maybe
No,
that's-
that was great. I think
Yeah.
that was that's just the thing, you know, the food waste far outpaces hunger globally and here in this country. The housing, the number of houses that are held and not lived in far outpaces the homelessness rate, and it is a matter of people holding more than they need, and you know, and resources not being shared equally, and that's the point, right?
That's the
So
point.
I'm gonna go ahead.
Sorry to
Go ahead.
interrupt
No,
you.
go ahead.
I want to mention my book. This is not about my book, but you know, this stuff there's much more to this. And it's in my book, The Way of Abundance, Economic Justice in Scripture and Society. Available all your usual outlets, local bookstores, even Amazon, Fortress Press. And I think Will's going to announce there's time for more
Yeah.
conversation
Yeah.
about a month from now.
So after you pick up a copy of Dr. Rasell's book, you can get it signed. You will have the opportunity. Dr. Rasell will be here in New Hampshire Monday, June 12th at 4:30 at the New Hampshire United Church of Christ headquarters in Concord, 140 Sheep Davis Road. I guess it's in Pembroke. Everyone's welcome. She'll also be preaching Sunday morning, June 11th at the Community Church of Durham. So depending on where you are in the state and when you're available, either Monday, June 12th at the NHUCC headquarters in Pembroke at 4:30, or at David Grishaw Jones's Community Church of Durham on Sunday, June 11th is the place to catch up and get your copy of The Way of Abundance signed. Edie, thank you so much for giving us your time tonight and for talking to us about your research. And I'm going to give a few upcoming events for New Hampshire Peace Action too.
I just want to say thanks to
go
all
ahead.
of you. You guys, you are the people who will bring about the new world. Thank you.
Hope. So we've got next Monday, a week from today, Moji Aga, who is an Iranian American man. He actually can't return to Iran because he has a death warrant on his head there. But Moji has been faithfully doing weekly 3-hour conversations between American peace activists and activists on the ground in Iran, which he translates from Persian to English to maintain discussions between activists trying to stop our countries from going to war. His organization is called the Iranian Nonviolence Project, and he'll be speaking to us next Monday at 7. 1 week after that, Nora Zukarna, who is a young woman who is just completing her law degree at Franklin Pierce Law School, but she grew up in Palestine and came to New Hampshire for her law degree. So Nora Zukarna, growing up in Palestine on May 15th. The next day, May 16th, we're going to have an action get together. So we hop on together, we write letters. We're going to be talking, we're going to try to get our House representatives to co-sponsor the repeal of the Iraq authorization for the use of military force. And then the very next Monday, May 22nd, youth peace building in conflict areas. We will have folks from Friends Forever Northern Ireland. So stick with us, keep coming back, and don't miss Dr. Rasell on June 11th and June 12th. Good night, everyone.
Wow, you guys.